Hello, Roland. Welcome to the Oral History program of the Heritage Center. If I recall right, you had a big role to play in the oral history program of this center. It was at your suggestion that we started this program a few years back. Do you have anything to say about the oral histories you've been involved with?
Yeah, I mean, usually I'm not used to sit on this side of the table. I've been conducting some, not so much like interviews for oral history programs. I've done that as well, but obviously I've done quite a bit of oral history myself for my own research. If you do contemporary history of science, right? And yeah, I didn't think I would be sitting here so soon. I don't consider myself usually being the target of an oral history program, right? Like being way too young, being 54 now, right? Like usually you have people in their 70s, 80s, 90s being interviewed. But I also felt like since I've been sitting so much on the other side of the table, I couldn't say no to meeting to meet up for this year and to be interviewed.
Well, why we want to ask you questions will follow soon.
Yes.
But to begin with, would you like to tell us about, you were born in Europe,
Yes.
and you landed up in South India in an IIT. How did that journey happen?
Yeah. It's, as many could imagine, it's a very personal journey as well. I've not thought that I would go to India. It was never like kind of in the cards. Even my own profession as historian of science, that has been transition as well. I started actually out as a physicist, started to study physics in the very end of the 80s in 89, and did my first degree in physics. But back then I was specifically interested actually in philosophy. Right. I would not say that I'm still that passionate about philosophy. But through my interest in physics and epistemology, I got very, very interested in how science actually works. So you could say the nature of science on one side, but also the interaction between science and society. And we had a group at the University of Oldenburg in Germany where I studied, which was basically also very much engaged in teacher education, which focused on history of science, and this is how I got into history of science. Basically redoing historical experiments, and then I was kind of hooked up with history of science. I also went in between, I went from Germany to Norway, studied in Norway at NTNU, which is also a technical university, similar. IIT Madras actually has a lot of relationships with NTNU as well, which is a technical university, interestingly also initially following the German model of the Technische Hochschule. So there are some parallels, and in Norway, first I got there when I studied physics as an exchange student, but then when I returned, because I wanted for personal reasons also to return to Norway, I also really wanted to continue with history of science. And what is important for what I did here then also, that I got interested into the local history of science. I already told you that there was also a German model and very strong links to Germany in Norway, in Trondheim. And I also, which is also very important for what I did here, is while I was doing writing my PhD on the history of science in Norway in the interwar period between World War I and World War II, that I also worked for some time at the Norwegian State Archive, which was archiving, at that point taking in the archive of what was Norges Tekniske Høgskole, which was like the German model of the Technische Hochschule, which the Germans also wanted to bring to IIT Madras. So there I got engaged with archiving, also with collecting historical instruments, which has become a bigger passion, but also I got involved with archiving, and this is then also something that I continued doing when I came to IIT Madras. After that, it's a rather long journey. In 2007, then after finishing my PhD and a postdoc, I went back to Germany and I taught to what you would translate as an assistant professor. I taught history of science at the University of Regensburg in southern Germany for 8 years and finally finished my habilitation, which is a German degree for qualifying to be a professor at a German university after your PhD. And after I finished my time in Regensburg, which was not a permanent position, I came to IIT Madras in 2015. And the background for that is, among other things, that I got married in between. I met my wife in between at a conference in Stockholm in 2001 while I was working on my PhD, and my wife is Indian, and she's also a historian of science. And through her, I came for the first time to India. So that also kind of opened up India for me. I hadn't been to India before. 2003, we got married, and this is also the time I came to India. And I had this idea, okay, I probably also want to come to India for a longer time, not only as a visitor, not only for family, since I have family. My wife is from Maharashtra, so I have family in Maharashtra, but also with my work. So I was already thinking this would at least be an opportunity. So then in 2014, I actually saw 2013 or 2014, the job was announced. I actually saw the job announcement for a position in history of science at IIT Madras. And actually, my wife forwarded this to me and said, Roland, actually, they say if you have an OCI card, so I do have an OCI card, you can actually apply as permanent faculty. And I said, oh, great, this is a faculty position, history of science, this is what I want to do, so I just applied for it. But I have to say, I had not been to Madras. The furthest south we've been to Kerala and we've been to Bangalore, but I had not been to Chennai before. But I had a bit of an idea about the IITs because my wife had started, not completed, but started at some point a PhD at IIT Bombay. And she told me about that, and she had a lot of friends from that time, from IIT Bombay. And also for her own research, we visited IIT Kanpur. So that was my background or my knowledge of the IITs, the IIT system when I joined here.
Right. So when you came here, you joined the humanities department.
Yes.
Which is a slightly different department from the rest because most of the others are scientific or technological departments. What was the department doing at this time? I mean, what?
Look, I have made the transition already before. Actually, in Norway, I was always in the physics department, and I felt always very welcome in the physics department, obviously, because also my own background is physics. But I think it's important, obviously my own conviction, it's very important to have humanities in an engineering institution, specifically in an engineering university as well. In Regensburg was not a technical university. We were in the philosophy department with the history of science. That's a little bit more, I would have to explain a little bit more why you would be in the philosophy and not in the history department, which I don't need to involve right now. That's a longer discussion. Yeah, so we had this, and there was also a long history. It started actually, the University of Regensburg started around the same time as IIT Madras, but they always had a history of science, and I also find it very important for a university to have history of science, and specifically also for a technical university like IIT Madras to have history of technology. And I thought it was very nice that they actually announced a position in this field. And there are not many earmarked positions in the field of history of science and technology in India. There's no programs in the history of science and technology in India. No, it has been very exciting for me, but obviously I wanted to be in the humanities department also back then. The humanities department had an undergraduate program in English literature and development studies, which I also found very attractive, the only IIT that actually had an undergraduate.
It was undergraduate, but it was called the Master of Arts, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's a 5-year integrated program, but a place where you have students for 5 years actually. So in Regensburg we had a program, but we only had a master's program, which actually, and before that we had a 5 years integrated program, and I think the 5 years integrated program worked much better in Regensburg. I saw the aftermath of the 5 years integrated program, because you have the students for 5 years.
Yes.
For a master's program, it's a very short period of time. You have a very diverse bunch of people you're having. That was at least my experience at Regensburg. So I was actually very happy with the humanities department back then, and with the 5 years integrated master's program in which I've also taught. So I've been very happy to teach mixed bags of students from both the humanities and science and engineering. I also very much like the BTech courses, so I've been teaching courses here in history of science, history of technology, public science and the public, and also technology and sustainable development, which I've greatly enjoyed teaching here. It's very, very nice with the students. So in that sense, yes, I think it has been good also to be with this topic in the humanities department.
So apart from teaching, you had research to
Yes.
conduct, and I think that's really where you started looking at IIT Madras history.
Yes, yes,
So this research took you to the German archives.
yes, yes.
So which are the archives that you can find material on IIT Madras in, and which ones did you visit?
Yeah. So maybe I should go a little bit back and start why I actually got interested in that.
Yes.
So strangely enough, I didn't know that there was a German connection when I came here, when I applied. I didn't do that much research on the university, right? Like you write, you have a position announced, right? Like you don't research the entire history of the university. So I only found out by the time that I was interviewed that there was actually the strong connection between India and Germany at IIT Madras. And it caught my attention, right? Like, and as I said, there were actually certain parallels with my earlier research work on history of science and technology in Norway, right? Like where there was also a very strong German connection, and where the university was also set up with a German model in mind. But you have to say also there are more differences, and probably the differences outweigh the similarities here. And I might not have to go into the details there, right? Like there was no involvement of the German government, for example. These things also, NTNU was, or the old Technische Hochschule was set up in 1910, so very different kind of time, not the Cold War. But I got very interested in this history, right? Like, so I thought, okay, this would be something worth looking at. And the bigger context for me has always been beyond the history of IIT Madras, the context of Indo-German techno-scientific relationships during the Cold War. I also was a little bit, I had not worked on the history of science and technology in India at all, and specifically not in the post-independence period, but my wife had actually worked on the history of nuclear physics in India from the interwar period to the post-independence period. So I knew a little bit about the context, so thinking about like science during Nehru in the first years of Indian independence. I had some, and specifically, as I said, we also went to IIT Kanpur. So I had some previous knowledge about the histories of and the international collaborations of the Indian IITs, but obviously not. What was new for me was the German collaboration, not the American collaboration. And so I wanted to study this history, and it obviously brought me to the Heritage Center and you. Because you knew already something about this, and there was a great exhibition here at that point. Still, we have a lot of these parts of that exhibition with photos. the Indo-German collaboration. So I would see all these great photos also. What I specifically enjoyed was the photos from the workshops and the laboratories, which is a very, very interesting source. So I came to the Heritage Center and I found actually quite a lot of sources for my history, but obviously there was no archive. The situation was I came here and I wanted to study this history, and there was no university archive where I could find sources for this. And parallel, I just started to look for sources in Germany, and I think this is where your question came in. And during my time in Germany, I started looking into the German archival sources and what had been written in Germany about the Indo-German collaboration.
Yeah. So which archives are these specifically?
I mean, I started like you would always do. I started to look a little bit at what has been written. So there was an organization that had been involved in the collaboration, which is called the Gesellschaft für technische Zusammenarbeit, later the Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit, which still exists. Unfortunately, they don't seem to have an archive, but since this has all been state activity, I went into the German federal archives, which would be equivalent to the German national archives to begin with. So there I found, it was really kind of a little bit of a puzzle, to be very honest. So I started with that archive, but there I didn't find anything before 1966, which corresponds actually with the second agreement, right? Like, and you see there was a transition of, institutionally, a transition of which ministry in Germany was responsible for the collaboration, which was to begin with the Foreign Office. So I later found out, okay, I have to look in the archive of the Foreign Office, and there you actually find documents that go back to 1956 and even predate the meeting, which is always mentioned, the meeting between Nehru and Adenauer. And obviously it makes sense that it predates it, because this kind of offer of the West German government to the Indian government to assist in setting up IIT Madras actually had been, the negotiations had started before the meeting between Nehru and Adenauer. But to begin with, I went to Koblenz, which is a nice city on the Rhine, not too far from Bonn. And it's there because Bonn used to be the capital of West Germany, so it was the Federal Republic of Germany. And I found this archive, as I said, where the record started from around 1966. And it was a very rich archive. It was enormous amount of material, a lot of records that had been written. So there existed from 1966 onwards also something called the Madras Committee, which organized the collaboration between the Indian and the German government, and that didn't exist in the beginning. So when the collaboration started, there was no such thing. And the Madras Committee was also started, was organized also from the early experience, and I guess we'll come back later to that, of how to organize or not organize this kind of collaboration. And the Madras Committee was a much more refined tool that had German bureaucrats, but also members of 4 mentor universities in Germany as being part of the Madras Committee, who organized the collaboration and supervised it and also made proposals, found collaborating partners and these kind of things. So there were like big files for each department, for example, who was the German faculty here, what was the status, who was coming over as a guest lecturer, and then there were a lot of reports written by the German staff, the German faculty as well, which you find in these archives. So that was one. Then obviously once you have these collaborating universities, they actually have, all these collaborating universities have university archives. So I went to 3 of them. I have to admit I have not been to Stuttgart, but Stuttgart has also been, so these collaborating universities in the Madras committee have been Aachen, Berlin, Brunswick, and Stuttgart. Right. Even though at some points you see that there are other German scientific institutions that have collaborated in this, but these were the main ones. Aachen is obviously still one of the main collaborating partners of IIT Madras. So I went specifically to Aachen, Berlin, and Brunswick, also because members of these universities have been specifically important for me. Robert Kraus, obviously the first, he was a professor at the University of Braunschweig. So you will find a lot of material on him in the University Archive of the University of Braunschweig. And in the second phase, it was Hans Havemann, who was a professor for international technological collaboration at the University of Aachen, who became a main character in my stories. So I found some material on him in Aachen. Elsewhere, Aachen was actually not that good. I was very surprised. The best was really the Technical University of Berlin, which had a lot of material from the Madras committee as well. And there was, when I started writing on a very specific collaboration on cryogenics, low temperature research, I was interested in a German clipping, in a German low temperature physicist who was working at the Max Planck Institute for, oh no, it was actually the Fritz Haber Institute, which is part of the Max Planck, it's the Max Planck Institute, on low temperature research and also as a research technology. And, but he was also an adjunct professor at the Technical University of Berlin at that point, and this is why they became like the collaborating partner for IIT Madras for this specific laboratory. And I found a lot of material on him, like his research, his reports in the archive of the Technical University of Berlin.
Well, I've read some of your work which you have published based on these findings and your work at the research at the archives. But with the knowledge that I've gained from there, I can ask you some questions. Like, there were 4 universities to begin with, at least, or maybe always. That
no, I think it was actually, to begin with, there was no university.
Right.
To begin with, and this really kind of connects to also the state of Germany after the Second World War, right? So to begin with, it was, as I said, it was planned out of the Foreign Office. And that also kind of shows the limitations of the planning, actually, because you can imagine the Foreign Office is probably not particularly good of any country, right? Like, it's not only the German government. They're not very experienced in setting up a university, right? So what is their experience in doing that, right? But there was also, later there came up a department of economic and technological collaboration, like development department, right? Like that defined a much more kind of development policy, you can say, of Germany as well, right? Like, which I wrote quite a bit about. But that came only later. And also there were these kind of experiences that in the first phase, they basically hired Robert Kraus, who had a lot of experience. Obviously, Robert Kraus, and we can talk about Robert Kraus if you want, was very interesting, very, very interesting character, who had previous experience from China. He's been very long in China. Yeah. And actually, there was one university that was set up in China already, the Tongji University, that was set up already before the First World War, which had then in Shanghai or close to Shanghai, which had very strong connections to Germany, or was set up as a German university before the First World War, where he had worked for many years.
Did you say before the First World War?
It was set up before the First World War. Robert Kraus only joined after the First World War. He wasn't as a faculty. He studied in Germany, engineering. He was a mechanical engineer. He was on gear systems. He was a specialist on gear systems. But then he worked for many years in China until the Civil War and the Second World War, the occupation of Japan happened, right? So he had to leave China, came back to Germany in the middle of the Second World War, then became a refugee himself in Germany after the Second World War, which is why he then went to IIT Kharagpur. And he was one of three German faculties at IIT Kharagpur. So it's interesting, there's an earlier history at the IITs of German faculty, and there was actually also German faculty at the Indian Institute of Science.
Yes.
So there were actually German scientists and engineers being hired in the aftermath of the Second World War. There was an active program by the Indian government to hire German engineers and scientists to bring them to India to help India after independence, because obviously there were two things. One is that a lot of the British experts left, right, like after independence, and then also that a lot of new institutions came up and a lot of new activities, and you see that there's a lot of international collaborations, both with East and West. I mean, my favorite one is actually Hindustan Machine Tools as a company, right? Like, and which had a lot of collaborations, both with countries from the Eastern and the Western Bloc. Actually, several collaborations with German companies for setting up machine tool manufacture, but also in watchmaking with Swiss companies, obviously.
Yes.
But even for example, the campus of HMT in Bangalore was planned by Czech architects. So these were like from Eastern Europe, right? So, so very interesting how this was all orchestrated, right? Like in the early times of independence. And yeah, also, I mean, India also accepted help. You see also collaboration with East Germany, with GDR. But this was obviously, when we come to the dynamics of the Cold War, we will come to the reason why Germany in the first place, actually, or West Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany, actually engaged in the collaboration with India. But then you see that this is actually part of a much larger policy of development aid, and actually India received a large portion of German development aid in these years, right?
So was Robert Krauss in the Madras committee ever?
No.
He was not.
No, he had actually left when it was set up.
I see.
But Braunschweig as a university continued. So I also looked, and this is what you can find, right? Like this is what you can find in the Braunschweig University archives, right? Like that they're actually asked, right? Like, so at some point there is a confusion in the German government as well. When they want to set up the Madras committee, they actually contact them and say, you're having official collaboration with IIT Madras, right? And they say, no, it's actually not official. We have one professor who's engaged in that collaboration. But it's not official. So it becomes official only after Robert Krauss then also retires. He also retires by the time he is stepping down as the advisor on this year he has a more official role in the last years. I think he steps down around 1964. But don't please read my publications for the exact dates. So he steps down before the second agreement. And he's also consulted. I mean, Hans Havemann, for example, meets with Robert Krauss. But you can say at that point, it's really a kind of shift. There's a total shift in how this is organized. Robert Krauss is out naturally also because he retires, right? Yes. And they organize the whole collaboration in a very different way.
So first there was this Foreign Office doing the planning.
Yes.
Or coming up with some recommendations. And then someone said that 4 institutions have to be involved. How did that happen? Was there somebody like Robert Krauss advising that all these academic institutions should be involved in the setting up of IIT Madras?
No, I think it was more like so that this kind of new department was being set up as well. Obviously, there was some discussion between people who went to IIT Madras and the kind of feedback they were getting from the faculty at IIT Madras, that things were not going very well. It was already, I mean, I've seen a letter by, as a historian of physics, I was also interested specifically in the physics department, a letter by Werner Koch to his own mentor, from where he also wanted to import the teaching methods to IIT Madras, from Robert Pohl, where he writes a letter in 1960. So Robert Koch was one of, no, Werner Koch, not Robert Koch. Werner Koch was one of the first faculty that came, one of the very few first faculty who came in the summer of, or June, July 1959, when IIT Madras opened. And in 1960, a year later, he writes to his mentor and says, look, we plan to be out here in 1963, but that's not going to happen. We're not going to be done in 1963. So he already knows in 1960 that this is not going to be enough time.
So the involvement of 4 institutions, far from being a very serious interest, it was, if anything, less than what was required. Is that the case, or was there other issues involved?
No, what do you mean with the?
I think it's a serious commitment if there are so many institutions involved.
Yeah, in 60.
So
what was done with the second agreement? What you have to see is that the first agreement runs out, I think, in 63, 64.
Yes.
I'm not very sure, 63
around
or 64,
yes.
yeah, around that time.
Yes.
So the idea was that the Germans would be here until the first batch of students would graduate, and then the job would be done.
Yes.
That was their idea, and you can say in the end of it, it was a bit naive. It was not built on any experience, because the German government has never done this before, right? Like, this has never been done before, and they were basically asking people, okay, what does it take to set up an engineering school, right? Like, and this is more like, what would it take to do the same thing in Germany, right? Like, and obviously this was not the case here. Plus, there were some serious delays, actually on both sides, on both the Indian and the German side. There were some serious delays in the planning, so they were behind schedule, right? Like, both in the Germans for sending over material, also sending over faculty, right? Like, they had plans of having, I don't know, 20 faculty to send over. They started, I think, with 5, 6 or so, right? Like, so the thing that would take shape very fast was the workshop, but everything else was basically behind schedule, right? So it was just not, the buildings were not finished, the labs were not finished, so there was still a lot of things to be done. And then the first agreement, it took some time before the second agreement was finally signed, right? Like, so the first agreement was extended for 2 more years until 66, and only then the agreement was signed. And interestingly, the new agreement was signed as a larger agreement on development aid between India and Germany. And it was much more thought through, I would have to say. And this was also when the Madras committee came up, and it was decided, okay. And then they basically asked around, right? Like, who would like to be? Braunschweig was obviously, was an obvious choice, because they had been involved informally before, and you can see that as well. And also, I mean, Robert Krauss has, we all know Siegfried Seinecke, who unfortunately has died. Seinecke came from Braunschweig, so also found correspondence between Krauss and the senior professor in electrical engineering, who was the mentor of Siegfried Seinecke, about how to set up electrical engineering department and whether he knew anybody as faculty. Right. So there were faculty from Braunschweig being involved, not because Braunschweig as a university was involved or as a technical university was involved, but because of Robert Koch's personal contacts to faculty in Braunschweig.
You've talked about German development aid at this time. So what was going on? What was Germany doing in terms of giving aid to, who was it assisting, and in what forms?
Okay, so the thing was really that this is, as I've described in one of my papers, this has really been a piece of science diplomacy, or science and technology diplomacy, as it is designed. The biggest story has always been in the post-Second World War history of science diplomacy is obviously nuclear technology. We're not talking about nuclear technology here, but really to mobilize, you can say, diplomacy for science and vice versa. Mobilize science for diplomacy. So what the Germans did on their side was basically mobilizing science for diplomacy. Their goals were not really engaging or enhancing scientific activity, really, but they wanted to gain soft power in India, on the ground here in India, and it had a lot to do with German foreign politics. So the German foreign politics, so this is 1956 when the offer is made. Germany becomes fully, or the West German, both West Germany and East Germany become fully sovereign a year before, in 1955. So then Germany is, on one hand, is reevaluating its place in the international community, and trying to find its place in the international community. But what's dominating very much the German foreign policy is the so-called Hallstein Doctrine. And it was seen as vital at that point, and that was that East Germany should not be recognized.
You mentioned that in your paper, yes.
Yes, and it sounds like a minor thing right now. It was really dominating. It was vital. It was kind of part of survival cause. You had, as you had partition in India between Pakistan and India, you had partition in Germany between East and West Germany. And the Cold War was kind of like, it was a warlike stance, right? And it was seen as vital that East Germany would not be recognized as a sovereign state by the Nehruvian government. It's a little bit like we have this dispute with China, Taiwan, right? Like we have similar issues right now, whether countries should be recognized as sovereign countries or not on the international arena, right? And for West Germany, it was very important that Nehru's India under Nehru would not recognize East Germany. And actually, they succeeded in that, right? Like, so India did not recognize East Germany until the 1970s. And in the 1970s, actually, the Hallstein Doctrine has been abandoned against a much more open policy where also the Federal Republic much more recognized the GDR, right? Like, and the relationship between the two Germanys had changed. So actually, the West German government, in a way, got what they wanted. And the Indian government got what they wanted. They got.
In terms of India, yes, but did the development aid diplomacy go to other countries as well?
Oh yeah. You can say, I mean, usual suspects. If you look at this, would Egypt would be there, right? Turkey, South America, right? Like, so there were a lot of countries that, and obviously there was this kind of political game of the Cold War, right? Like, and also. For both, I mean, also for East Germany, right? Like, East Germany tried also to gain influence in India, right? Like, they came here in 1959, for example, the same time, and they set up IIT Madras. The East German government also came with a delegation, for example, among other places, to Madras, and they also had scientists in their entourage, right? And also Indian students went to East Germany, got training in East Germany, right? Like, so you can say that both of them committed aid to India, and among other things, specifically in the first phase, it was really not about a refined development policy of West Germany. That came with but that's the interesting turn which I've described in my paper as well, with Hans Havemann coming in, where the West German government then started to follow a much more long-term goals in terms of techno-scientific collaboration with India. So whether that's the interesting turn that comes then in 1966, where it's very clear it's not enough to come for 4 years, set up a teaching institution and go, but you say, no, we want to have a long-term engagement. And I guess the West German government or IIT and West German institutions have actually succeeded in that, in the sense that there's still a lot of collaborations between IIT Madras and German institutions.
But IIT Madras was the only institution of its kind that was created during this development aid period.
You mean?
Of its kind anyway, this research, technological research institution that was created. Was there anything else created in any other part of the world?
Oh, by the German government?
By the German government, yes.
No, not really, no. And it was always mentioned that this was the biggest institute. Actually, if you look at the aid, and we can come back to that later, the German government actually never wanted to set up a research university in the first place. And I mentioned that. But they were actually much more oriented towards practical education, vocational training.
This would be the academic institutions, or was it the ministry which had this goal?
No, the ministry, and it was much more the ministry also. And you have to see, it's also, if you look at German industrial structure, right? Like you can say that these Technische Hochschulen, the technological research universities, they make only a small portion of the German technical education. And what German technical education, obviously the Technische Hochschulen are very well known, but what Germany is probably more known for is actually vocational training, right? Like it says very strong vocational training.
Yes.
And it's a sector where one might say India has never succeeded after independence, which is probably a big dilemma in India. You can say traditional Indian arts and crafts was great, and India has not been able to capitalize on that, on the kind of more practically oriented vocational sector, right? Whereas IIT obviously has become a very successful institution.
That's right.
So Germany has actually been involved. If you look at the GT sets, all the other projects, there were some projects with universities, but most of it was actually on the level of vocational training and also the lower colleges, the lower engineering colleges.
Right.
So not the academic institutions actually. And there has been, and German historians of technology has pointed this out as well, right? Like that you cannot reduce excellence in technological education to the research universities and to the elite institutions. But you really need to connect this, and this coming back to the workshop training, which they also try to establish at IIT Madras, and which they did establish during their time. You need to connect this to vocational training and to the workshop.
Right. So there was this, from what I gather from your papers, is that there was this German blueprint, as it were, to set up a certain kind of technical institution.
Yes.
Whereas there was an Indian version as well,
yes,
which was rather different. So what was happening when it came to execution of the project? What happened when the two sides met?
Okay, yeah. I mean, I would say from the beginning, I mean, the different standpoints were made clear from the beginning. In the normal historiography, the normal way, I mean, in the standard historiography of the IITs, it's always pointed out that the MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, would be the model from the Indian side. You never see MIT mentioned in any of the documents when they talk about IIT Madras. Never. And obviously the Indian side would be stupid to go to the German side and say, can you build us an MIT? And then they would say, no, that's the US, right? Like you're coming to the wrong place. But they actually mentioned very early on, and this is the first model they mentioned, the German model they mentioned is actually RWTH Aachen. So the Technical University of Aachen, which I've already mentioned was part of the Madras mentorate and is still the main collaborator in Germany, was actually the first what was mentioned.
Was Aachen the German equivalent of the US MIT?
No, I would not. They were different. I mean, at that point, you can say the most prestigious German research university was the Technical University of Berlin. But Berlin had problems because of partition. The Technical University of Berlin was part of West Berlin, but it was very vulnerable in this island situation. Back then, I mean, the wall was built, right, like in '61, so this is all happening during the time. The Cold War is very hot at that point, right, and West Berlin is not a good place. It's also get heavily deindustrialized actually at that point. Berlin used to be a heavily industrial city if you look at all the electrical engineering and stuff. So, so you can say the Technical University of Berlin used to be traditionally the biggest, the most prestigious technical university, but right after the war, it really has this kind of problem. Aachen has the great advantage, it's almost in Belgium. It's very much to the west of Germany. But it's definitely one of the leading technical universities. It was definitely one of the leading technical universities. It was sufficiently far in the west that it was not kind of threatened to become part of a kind of border a dispute or any kind of dispute, right? Like a lot of the new institutions, Bonn as the capital is actually very close to Aachen. So the capital was very close to Aachen. And again, Bonn was chosen because it was very, very much in the proximity of France, right? Like on the western. If you look at the development of nuclear research in Germany, it was deliberately placed as far away from the East German border as you could, right? So Aachen was certainly one of the most, traditionally the most prestigious research universities with a very heavy industrial, tradition in industrial collaboration. So certainly a good model, but also one that was located politically in a safe location, I would say. And it was actually on the Indian sides, for the names, please read my papers. But it was mainly planned not by engineers, but by economists, economic advisors to the government of India. And they had studied Germany, and they thought Aachen would be a good model. Right. So they mention Aachen. Whereas the German government, from the beginning says, yeah, we can do this. So it's kind of, it's also, again, economists, also kind of German economists who kind of start the discussion, kind of write to the ministry and say, look, we think the Indians would like this, would like to have this kind of offer, and we can gain soft power. We can gain influence in India by this. So then the West German, the Foreign Office basically says, one of the things is say, oh, this is actually great, we can do this. They feel very confident that the Germans can do this, that they have expertise in engineering education, and this is something they're good at. But they also say, look, this is actually quite cheap, right? Like this is at the same time they set up Rucola, the steel plant, which has a much bigger. It's a much bigger project, right? Like so, setting up an engineering school is definitely much cheaper. But specifically, also they say, look, if we set up an engineering college, not a university, is actually much cheaper because we don't have to do research labs and these kind of things, right? Yes. So, but officially they will never say that. They don't want to sound cheap, right? Obviously they will never say that, even though you find it in the documents, find it mentioned. It's much cheaper to set up a non-academic college with more practically oriented training. But they say, look, this is what India needs. Obviously, you can question whether the German Foreign Office knows what India needs, but from their assessment, what they say, look, this is what the Indians need. They don't need another technical university. So this is the kind of stance, right? Like the Indian side is very clear they want to have a research university, what's called in the American context a research university, and the German model for that would be RWTH Aachen. And the Germans say, oh, what we want to set up is a Technische Lehranstalt, and that is still, and that's the kind of notion for a non-academic. So you have Technische Hochschule, which is equivalent to a university, but a technical university, and a Technische Lehranstalt, which is non-academic, is more practical, right, and doesn't have the same kind of academic credentials, doesn't give PhDs, for example. And this is negotiated all the time, and finally they use a wording of höhere technische Lehranstalt, which doesn't exist in German, right? Like to find a kind of compromise. But you see in the German documents until 1966, they always talk about Technische Lehranstalt and not Technische Hochschule.
That's the first agreement. The
first agreement is always Technische Lehranstalt.
Right.
And obviously this is part of the problem, that they also see, apart from the other problems I said, that that they're behind schedule with setting up IIT
Well,
Madras.
that's
but
really
they
one
also,
of my questions. I mean, what were the deliverables that they had in mind when they, was it the buildings or was it the?
Yeah, the buildings.
I mean, after all, the students had graduated, the first batch graduated.
Yeah, but the buildings was obviously there, you know, the
so
first.
they were looking at infrastructure.
Yeah, infrastructure, right? Like the first, and I can tell you in terms of Werner Koch, the first physics professor, he said he never got a suitable, even in up to 69, he said he never got suitable conditions for teaching. And he talked about the lecture theater, right? Like to begin with, obviously the building was not finished. They had to teach in other institutions, right? Like there was a number of places where
the first 2 years.
I think at the Leather
outside.
Research Institute and Gindi and
the Leather Research Institute was the administrative office. So they had classrooms in the AC Tech, AC College, and I think in the Gindi Engineering College as well.
So the Germans came, and for example, Koch came with teaching equipment, right? And one part of this teaching equipment was to do lab courses for the engineers, and part of it was he had this idea of, or he came with this tradition of lecture demonstrations. To base his teaching on very heavily on doing demonstration experiments. And he could not do that, obviously. He got these instruments, but first they were in crates, right? Like, and they came here, the buildings were not finished. He had to teach in these premises, right? Like, so he had to do this. What he really didn't want to do is like the blackboard teaching. He said, and that was really not the way how the Germans wanted to teach, specifically, and was partly also because this was the way how it was done in Germany. It was very hands-on. So the professor would do a lot of demonstration. And they saw specifically because the Indian faculty, there was Indian faculty already here as well, they were mainly theoretical, right? Like they would do the blackboard teaching. And the Germans said, no, we have to do it all based on more practice, right? Like in the physics, I know this best, right? So he came with this model from his mentor from Robert Pohl, who had devised a system of lecture demonstrations which Koch wanted to execute here during his teaching, but he finally resigned and retired because he had reached retirement age in 1969, so he was here from 1959 to 69, and he never really got to do this. And partly also, even once they got the lecture halls, they were not, the lecture halls were not suitable because the thing was that the lecture halls were built by Indian architects. And also the Indian administration did not understand this. So there was obviously a different understanding of how teaching should be done between the German faculty, specifically, I can say this specifically on the example of Werner Koch. And the Indian faculty, and they actually did send 2 lecturers to Germany to be taught in this kind of lecture demonstration culture. And it was not that the Indians were not interested in that, but it was nothing they had grown up. It was nothing the Indian faculty had grown up with. Right?
So while all this was going on, I mean, time was passing, and as you say, the period of the first agreement was coming to an end. I mean, approaching so close, and if I read your papers, I get the impression that in the second agreement, there's a sudden desire to set up these lab-type workshops where there's going to be research conducted. So it looks as though at that transition, the Germans have come to an understanding that they need to shift to a different kind of institution.
There are several reasons for that. One was that obviously Germany saw itself in the competition with the Soviet Union, which assisted IIT Bombay, but also actually with the Americans, even though they were part of the same bloc, right? Like, but they were like in the competition in development aid with the Americans as well. They're very keen on establishing what they call German methods, right? Like, and also make this succeed. As I said, they wanted to gain influence in India, right? And they basically concluded we cannot lose this, right? Like, we cannot stand there and look as so we have to be at least as good in our aid as both the Soviets and the Americans, right? Like, we cannot stand back. So it was in this competition, and they saw that they had to step up their collaboration, and they also saw that both these set up research universities, specifically the Americans, right? Like they brought MIT in actually, so they brought in, it was probably, I'm not very sure, but it was probably the experience of the Americans who actually brought in a consortium of American universities that also made the Germans realize that they had to do something similar. Okay, this is not coming, this is my suspicion, this is not coming right now from the archives, but obviously IIT Kanpur started a couple of years later than IIT Madras, but then by the time, right, like the first agreement had run out, they're discussing intensely that they might lose the competition against the IIT Bombay, but increasingly also they see themselves in a competition with the Americans. They say, look,
well, we
cannot lose our face.
No, when you say lose the competition, was there a risk of a different country coming and signing another agreement with IIT
No,
Madras?
not that.
Was that the situation or what?
No, I mean, like, you see, like, even Robert Koch, he saw himself, right? Like, it's almost like the Olympics, right? Like, that we should be, look, this is something we are good at, right? Like, this was part of, like, kind of the German pride as well, you could say, right? Like, and this German self-understanding, German identity, right? Like, this is something we are good at. We cannot lose this. We're going to lose face here, right? Like, we're going to lose our standing in this country, right? Like, which again is linked to having influence in India, being seen as somebody who can do things, right? So then they understood, look, we have to increase our engagement in this project, right? Like, obviously the budget was then, if you look at the budget, right, like it was like double, tripled, it became much more expensive than what they had to begin with assumed. Still, I think in the bigger picture, it wasn't that big. In the bigger picture of development aid, it was still a rather reasonable investment, right? But it became much more expensive, and specifically also because of the research infrastructure that they were setting up. There was some talking about research infrastructure even before. But Robert Koch, for example, Werner Koch, for example, was actually hired because, and this is very typical for the German faculty, he did not have any teaching experience, but he had very long research experience from the AEG Research Lab, which was one of the biggest electrical engineering companies, and he had research background from semiconductor research. In India already back then still, right, like the discussion is still going on with an Indian semiconductor industry now with microchip industry, right, like already back then it was very clear that semiconductor industry would be very, very important. India wanted to set up a semiconductor industry, and Robert Koch was somebody who understood this. So what was very important in the Indian understanding is to hire faculty that had substantial industry experience. But at the end, it was actually that he was also very engaged in teaching. And at the end, Werner Koch didn't do any research, right? Like, so he had some idea that he would also start getting involved in semiconductor research, but this didn't happen. So, but obviously for the physics department, semiconductor research remained a top priority. So if you look at cryogenics, which I also researched a little bit, that was part of the initiative to prop up semiconductor research, solid state physics at the physics department. That came then later. And this was really then, that was kind of the spirit of, okay, we have to do this. And for me, in my documents, I found Hans Havemann was really a very central person to that, who understood that very well, and who was part of, as I said, a professor in international technological collaboration, who was an engineer himself. He was a specialist on combustion engines, somebody who had been professor at the Indian Institute of Science for some years, and who had a very different vision for IIT Madras than the first planning, right? Like, this really has to become a modern research institution, very much in the lines of Indian Institute of Science, right? Like, and also kind of really a new generation, a different generation, you can say, than Robert Krauss.
So apart from the budget, was there a big increase in the number of German professors who come in as well at that time?
Yes. years. It was basically doubled, so the numbers that were mentioned. So in the first agreement, for example, which was also then very clear indicator for what happened, the first agreement had very clearly stated what kind of workshops would be set up. And then labs are mentioned, but they're not specially mentioned. Whereas in the second agreement, the labs are listed in great detail. Right? And the numbers were basically doubled. So the numbers mentioned was from 20 to 40 German experts. And you see a lot of hiring of experts, specifically not for teaching, not as a senior professor for teaching, but for setting up specific labs, right? Like the microscopy lab, right, for example, and other kind of labs. So that was, for example, one of them I looked specifically at. So you got faculty coming over for a certain number of years to set up specific labs. And at the same time, what they did is they were looking for collaborating labs in Germany. So, this becomes specifically clear with the cryogenics research, but all these labs, basically at the physics department, which I saw, they were kind of looking for collaborating labs in Germany. And rather than bringing German faculty over here, is to have a kind of tandem between an Indian staff and a German staff, and helping them setting up and running these labs as, you can say, research technology, as research infrastructure. And then Germany has been prouding, obviously I've never studied that, but Germany has been prouding it having contributed with most equipment of all of these collaborating. So they've sent over more equipment to IIT Madras than the Americans had sent to Kanpur, or the Soviets had sent to Bombay, right? But then also the collaboration actually lasted quite long. I mean, the Madras committee outlasted the presence of the Germans. Really, I think it went on to 76, but again, please read my papers for the exact year. But even though the strong presence of German faculty being here lasted till 74, but even after that, the Madras committee went on, and then also agreements continued, right? Like collaboration agreements continued. But that was very much in the spirit of what Hans Havemann had actually drawn up to say, look, we want to have a long-term collaboration here, and much more something that is more, that should at least develop into an equal collaboration. Obviously, all these collaborations were not on equal, just of the nature of the collaboration. It did not start out as an equal collaboration, but it should develop into a more equal collaboration between two more or less equal partners.
Right. I mean, this period that you are talking about, now it relates, what you said relates with the alumni's perception of that period, to say that the institution was full of German faculty members and German staff. So moving on to that question about equal partnerships and versus a German mentorship kind of situation. You have written about the cryogenic lab, which was set up in IIT in 1970, wasn't it?
71.
71?
Yeah, but it's obviously it has been a process more like. But 71, actually the liquefiers have been set up.
Was that an isolated instance of that kind of collaboration, or were there other labs that?
No, there are many other labs, but this is one. The only one I looked at a little bit, which was less, I would say, from my perception, was less successful, was the electron microscope laboratory. So there was a Siemens Elmiscope electron microscope, and what, as far as I know, the first female faculty, Edith Butenut, who came over here to help setting that up. Yes. And she also wrote about her frustration of setting that up. So I thought, and I've mentioned it in one of my papers, but then I thought, okay, I don't want to look into this in any more great detail. It was also a little bit difficult. I tried to find a faculty here who remembered that electron microscope, but I saw that there was some kind of confusion with other electron microscopes later, and I thought, okay, I rather look into the cryogenic lab, because it looks like it has been a much more successful, actually, collaboration. So my idea was also to say, okay, one can look into failure, and one can, whether it's failure is also very problematic, it's problematic wording. Yes. But I thought more as looking into something that was probably more perceived as a very successful collaboration between Indian and German scientists on the ground, right?
Specifically, there were Dr. Klipping and Dr. Srinivasan.
Yes.
On the Indian and German sides.
Yes. Yes, and it looked like there was some writing. And also the big advantage was that Professor Srinivasan is still alive. At least I interviewed him, right? Yes. Yes. And as I said, a big problem with writing these kind of more, you can say, symmetric histories, right? Like one of the big problems, obviously, and we can come back to that, why I wanted to set up the archive of IIT Madras is obviously that it almost feels like a déjà vu, right? Like we have a lot of this colonial history where people get scholarships to go to the British Library to visit the archive of the British East India Company to write Indian history, right? Like instead of visiting Indian archives. And we see, and I have that with some of my PhD students as well, right? Like if you want to write a lot about the history of science and technology in India, it becomes very difficult to find the sources, right? Like because archives are not that much developed, and that IIT Madras did not have an archive is rather the norm than the exception, right? Like none of the other IITs have archives. So, right. So part of my intention to set up the archive here is to say, look, we have to safeguard the documents that are still here. It's not that there are no documents in India. It's just that they have to be preserved and they have to be made accessible in a way for historical research, right? Like, and so this was locate as well. Easy to look. That's what I mean also with accessible, right. That you can actually search them, right? Like so. For example, how did I find the archives in Germany? Obviously, you do like an internet search and you find, okay, this in this archive says this in this holdings. It's a bit more complicated with the university archives, but you can find, if you know where to look, you can find them, right?
Well, if you actually went there, let's say to a university archive that's not available online, could you actually search, I mean, sit at a console or somewhere and do exactly
I mean, most of them, they don't have their catalogs online, right? Like that's also, I mean, it's always a question how much of your material you have online. Most of it is not online, no, but you can search their database, right? Like, and you only find out once you're at the archive. The archive will always surprise you, right? Like you only once you visit the archive, you will find what they have. Obviously, what you have a lot of times, which is very nice, that a lot of these archivists, they help you a lot. So you can write to them. Sometimes they would even send you material.
Yes.
And we have some examples here. Thomas Taru, who has been doing some research, for example, he wrote to these archives rather than going there themselves.
Yes.
And they will send you something. But as a serious researcher, always you have to do it yourself, right? Like at the end of the day, if it's an important archive, you have to go there yourself, because you will understand better than the archivist what you're looking for, and you will always look you will look at the archival material, but you always kind of look a little bit around. What do you find? Maybe you find some more material, right? Yes. So you have to get a feel for the archive. And so that's what I did. So these archives I've all visited.
You spent a lot of time there. I mean, that's part of the research.
Yeah, a lot. I mean, in Indian archives, you have to bring much more time. A lot of times, you know, you go to it's very well organized, right? Like, you go there, you write to, first you write to the, I mean, we teach this to students, right? Like, how do you access the archive? And in India, you have to bring much more time. If you want to use this Tamil Nadu State Archives, right? Like they say, I have 2 days, can I do work in your archives? They'll laugh at you, right? And there in Germany, actually it works. So obviously, it's always a little bit tricky how much time you plan for the archive, but the key is really to prepare your visit very well. So you write to the archivist, you ask them, you say, look, this is what I'm looking for, right? Like, can you tell me what you have? And they will give you they do a little bit research for you, and they will say, look, this is what we probably have. And then you come over there, and you've already ordered the boxes, the archive boxes that you want to look at. Right. So they keep it ready for you. You come in, and you can look through the archive boxes. They're well structured. they usually know all archives allow you to take your mobile phone with you, and you basically take copies. So I have like thousands of copies of documents. Actually, it's a disadvantage as well, because you take so much material home with you, right? Like, so what you end up now with all this modern technology, you take a lot of material home with you, and then only there you start reading in detail. Yes. Whereas in the old days, actually, you would sit there, you would take notes, yes, and would save you a lot of time in the aftermath, and you would look at the essential, right, instead of taking more material home with you, right? But that's part of the problem of big data, obviously. So, yeah.
So when did you get inspired to propose an IIT Madras archive? Was it right as soon as you joined here, 2015, or progressively, or after you finished all this research?
No. I mean, obviously, I think we started talking about this in 2016. So it was part of the process of getting acquainted with IIT Madras. I also always felt, I mean, and I've been doing this before as well in Trondheim, right? That I wanted to engage with the institution, and also, rather than getting some other kind of administrative responsibility as faculty here, right, that I would do, but probably not specifically enjoy, right? I thought I could do this, yes, and it would be of great service to IIT Madras, and it's something I'm good at, I can do, which I guess nobody else, at least at that point, understood at IIT Madras, what it means to set up an archive. So it's something that I would enjoy doing, and that would also help me to get to know the institution, right? Like, because basically you have to talk to everybody, yes, to go through. I mean, now obviously a lot of that work has been done by Ponarasu, who has been doing the detailed survey. Yes. But it was great, as obviously we did this together when we went around and basically explored, right?
We went to various offices looking at what they had. Yes.
Yeah. So it was very exciting, because you don't know what you're going to find, right? Like, maybe you find you remember some snakes and scorpions. Found some termites, finally. Yes, we did. Yes. And it's kind of a little bit like discovery, right? So, like, you go out and you explore, right? Like, you're like an explorer in dusty rooms, right? And you don't know what you're going to find, right?
Like exploration.
Yeah. So, but I also knew, because I've done that before, not so much with archives, but more with collections. This is what needs to be done, right? Like,
well, that's something else, isn't it? That you could have looked at. I mean, we don't have a collection of heritage equipment, if I may call it that.
Yeah. But there's still this kind of idea, look, that I found the archive to be more essential. Even like, look, if you look at equipment and you don't have the documentation for the equipment, which you will find in the archive, right? Like, so the way, for example, when I worked in Norway also, right? Like, we had an archive, right? Like, and a lot of times you find equipment, you don't know what it is, right? Like, because it's some things, the faculty is not there anymore, right? Like, let's talk about like that electron microscope, right? Like, you will find an electron microscope, you don't know anything about it. So you really need the paper archive to find out who bought it, why was it bought for, who used it, how long was it used for, all these kind of things, yes, right? So if we talk about the cryogenic equipment, for example, I've never really tried to find the cryogenic equipment. I could probably do that, right? Like, but without a functioning archive, I would still say the archive is, and I think some people in the administration here also understand this, is very important for the functioning of an institution, not only for historical value, right? Like, obviously there's other aspects to the archive. There is obviously not only the academic historian who uses archives, there's also, I don't know, we already saw that it has great value for alumni, right? Like, they find something about their own times of study here. We'll find the alumni photos, which is not an academic study, but again, it has great value. But it has also great value for the administration, yes, right? Because basically what happens is, once records become inactive, right? Like, they're not active records anymore, administration just puts them away somewhere. It doesn't necessarily throw it, but they don't know what to do with it. They don't know how to access it, right? Like, it's basically out of their reach. And it's the role of the archive to access that, right? Like, and there's other administrative uses, right? Like you might say that it's good to have, let's say, the first drawings of a building that you're having, right? Like for other uses as well,
Yes. Yeah.
right? Or that you have a record when you have, for example, a dispute for pension, whether somebody has been working at an institution at a certain time, right? Like somebody comes and says, oh, I should draw a pension from this, but well, I'm not getting the money, that you can go to the archive, right? Like, and we had these kind of requests, for example, at the State Archive in Norway, right? Like where people would have these kind of requests to the archive, right? Like, so even for the functioning of the institutions, right? Like if you think about, and I mean, there have been some disputes here, right? Like about, like, for example, the land, who owns the land of IIT Madras, how was it given, right? Like these kind of things. So that's where functioning archives are of great value, not only to the historians, but also to the administration of an institution, right? To be able to dive into its history and how have things been done.
Right. And a document archive obviously requires much less space than a repository of heritage equipment.
Oh yeah.
And that's a big advantage too.
Yeah, yeah. Archives is very easy, specifically administrative archives are kind of very easy to organize. I mean, basically what you do, and this is what we did, right? Like we just went around and saw what is there on paper.
Yes.
And then we decided, okay, what are we going to keep from this paper? And there are actually already retention schedules, like plans, what should be kept, what should not be kept. Part of that is actually government regulations, right? Like, so you can go to the National Archives, and they've actually already done this kind of work. It has just never been executed. What IITs should take care of their material, but what they would prescribe is actually much less of what. Obviously, we're keeping all that, but then there's a lot of what, at least by law, is not considered to be kept, that we find very valuable keeping. For example, I would always come with the example of correspondence, right? Like obviously meeting protocols. So by law, people would say, okay, what we need to keep is like budget, meeting protocols, reports, and these kind of things, right? Like that's often kept as a record, legally kept. But then correspondence, for example, which is great to reconstruct histories, right? Like correspondence is usually not kept. So one of the things that we found was the archive of the director's office with a lot of correspondence, and we definitely want to keep all that. Yes. Because specifically the way how IIT Madras is organized, a lot of things are negotiated through the director's office. So that's a great source to understand how things have been done. So that's a document thing, but then if you come to objects, it's actually specifically contemporary history is very difficult. Because, I mean, you can, even here, you can go around and you see a lot of junk equipment in the corridors. Things are being thrown out all the time. So what do you keep and what do you throw? And it's not a very easy decision. And first, actually, you have to understand a lot of the institution before you can take that decision. Right? You can say paper archives, you're not the first one who collects them. Right? Like they have already a pre-structure. Because they have been created by administrative units, usually, yes. Right? Yes. So that's relatively easy. Even if you take like personal papers of somebody, they have kind of pre-structured that. The kind of junk you find from labs here is not like that. You can say if you go into deeper history, right? Like if I talk about the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, I've mainly been collecting from the time period before the Second World War. That was much easier for several reasons. One, there's not that much left. Second, it was a much smaller institution back then, even after the war has become much bigger. But one of it is also the nature of the equipment that you want to collect. So the oldest material from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology was, in the physics department, was already a collection. It was a collection of teaching instruments at the department. Right. So it was already organized as a collection. And most of it was still there. So it wasn't that much, but it already had a structure of a collection. Whereas if you take a lab, a lot of the stuff is modular. right? Like you get something from an instrument rack, right? Like also these labs have been modernized. They've been functioning for 40 years. They've always been modernized. Then some of the equipment has been built at the workshop here, right? Like, which is great. As a historian, you say that's great, but it doesn't make it easier to collect it, to document it, to find out what it is, right? So a lot of that kind of stuff is very difficult, actually, to collect and to document, which doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. Obviously, I think this should be done in India as well. But it's a much bigger task. As you say already, it's much more expensive.
Yes.
You need huge storage rooms, right? Like you need huge expenditures to do that. And yeah, so I think, yes, we should do that, but the archive, to me, has priority right now. And in India, if you think there are a few good examples of archives, you can say even less so of instrument collections. So I always bring the example of the Science Museum in London, which is a great museum. It's also, obviously, it's a big tanker, right? Like it's a big ship. And people look at its exhibition and say, oh, this is great, right? Like, but then they have never seen their collections. So the collections of the Science Museum in London, right now they're also all being centralized in an old Second World War airport. So they got an entire airport with hangars full of equipment.
So it's just the tip of the iceberg that the exhibition shows.
Yes, it's only the tip. There's probably 80, 90, 95%, which is in the storage. And obviously, it's a nightmare. You imagine, right? Like, so first, look, if the British Air Force is done with one aircraft model, right? Like, it's very easy for them to give it to the museum. Say, here, you get the aircraft. And then you're a creator, you get a whole aircraft, like, which is very difficult to maintain, right? Like, to preserve, whatever, right? And then you have it in a Second World War hangar, right? Like, and concrete parts are falling onto your aircraft, right? And it's very difficult, right? Like, it's very costly, and there's a lot of problems with that, right? Like, but it's obviously it's a kind of cultural infrastructure that is there that has not been established to that extent, right? Like, I mean, obviously you have in Chennai, for example, you have the Madras, the government museum, right? Yeah. The Madras Museum. But it's not, sorry to say, it's not a very well-functioning, as the archives, it's not a very well-functioning institution, right? It has been set up as part of the British colonial infrastructure, obviously, like the archive. But it's not a place where you can say, oh, I have some stuff from the history of technology of India, can you please take care of it, yes. Right? Which is the way how the Science Museum works, right? Like they actively collect, right? Like either they move out and they say, we would like to collect this, can you give this to us? And they have a process how it comes in, right? Like, I don't want to make it sound too perfect. There's a lot of problems. I've been as a researcher at the Science Museum in London as well. But they have this kind of process, right? Like where they do active acquisition. They say, what should be representative of the history of technology of Great Britain, right? Like, and obviously, even if you go to Indian history, right? Like, we've done some research on the Indian history. They have, specifically from the colonial times, they have lots of very interesting stuff from India, right? So, but even, I mean, there's a lot of discussion of kind of decolonization and giving collections back to the countries. In India, where would they give it to? Who would they give it to, right? Like, you could locate a lot of objects from the history of India. There's no institution in India that would be able to actually properly take care of it, right? So it's both archives and museums, not only as exhibition places. Like obviously there's a lot of science museums in India, but like if you open it up, you see they're basically science centers, yes. Right? Like the Tamil Nadu science centers, and they're doing a great job. They're doing great work, but obviously they don't have, they're not institutions that are set up to preserve the scientific and technological heritage of India, right? So obviously IIT Madras could do something in this way, but first please get an archive. Please first get the archive running, yes. And then we're talking about a much bigger task actually than the archive.
Yes, right. Sure. That's in the future.
That's in the future, but then you also have to see, like we are talking about archives, obviously also we as archives are part of an already existing network of Indian archives, specifically with the NCBS archives, right? Like in other, we are collaborating with the Roger Mutia research library here, right? So that you then also see, if you talk about collections, that we then also should look at a much larger collaboration of museums, collections in the material heritage of Indian science and technology, which, as I said, would be much more difficult.
Right. So you have possibly initiated the archive at a time when this kind of awakening about the importance of archives is happening in other institutions as well, simultaneously. So the situation may change in the years to come.
Yeah. No. Obviously, I would look ahead, but I thought this was something. Look, I'm also, in many ways, also a pragmatist. And I've always said, look, I don't want to build big castles, right? Like, I want to have a functioning archive. Yes. That's it. I think the institution needs it, and then we can see what we do from them, right? Like, one step at a time. Right. And this is what we should be doing now. And I'm very happy once the archive opens and becomes operational. Yes. And not only that, I mean, there's also an issue with institutions in India, right? Like, a lot of times they don't function that well, I have to say. A lot of times they depend very much on personalities. And my interest was always not to set up Roland Wittje's archive, but to set up the archive of IIT Madras that is owned by IIT Madras, where IIT Madras as an institution takes ownership and understand what its role and its function is. And once I leave, and as we know, I will be leaving in a few months from IIT Madras, this should continue. Right? So it's in many ways a question of sustainability and the meaning of sustainability, right? Sure. That it should not only exist today, but also in the future. It should be there in 30, 40, 100 years, right? Like, it should still be around. Yes. as one of the essential infrastructures of this institution for historical research, but also for other reasons.
Well, beyond archives, there is in your researches took you to some people who are associated with IIT Madras in the early years. If I remember right, you have met Professor Sainaki.
Yes.
And spoken to him, and he was here sometime in the 1960s.
Yes, early 60s.
For a few years at least, yes. So, what was your experience with these interviews like? I mean, this is one interview I remember.
Yeah.
And the other one I remember is with Mrs. Shear.
No, I don't think I met her.
Did you meet her?
No, I didn't meet her, but I met somebody in Germany as well.
Yes.
I think it was Joachim. I just have to look. Yeah, Joachim Holz. I actually met Joachim Holz in Wuppertal. So these were the two people I actually interviewed myself.
Yes. So this is outside the archive system?
Yeah, it's outside. Yeah, this is also, I asked a bit more also specific questions regarding my own research, what I wanted to know from them. With Siegfried Seinecke, obviously you have done an interview with him.
Yes, we did.
I think with Joachim Holz you have not done an interview.
No.
But I just wanted to know how they got here. I mean, Siegfried Seinecke was certainly somebody, he had been coming back again and again. So he has very much taken to India. He got very fond of India.
That's right.
So I think even I met him several times here that he came back. Yeah, I mean, he was a very young, like I think he had just completed his PhD when he came over here, right? Like, he was very young, and I would say
he was in industry, wasn't he, rather than an academic institution?
When he came here, he came basically, as far as I understand, right from his PhD. Right. So he had neither teaching nor research experience. He was rather young. And obviously, if you talk to these guys, they were quite adventurous, right? Like Joachim Holz actually as well, probably even more so. He was certainly an adventurer. I mean, he came here with his own car, right? Like, he came driving to India, right? Like, which you wouldn't do anymore because of the political situation. But back then, you could actually drive from Europe to India, right? So he would come with his own car. And he showed me, like, he had an album when they went with the car to Africa, right? So he was, and then they were fixing their own car. So a group of young boys or young men, right, like, who went to Africa. And so I think Joachim Holz certainly, but also Siegfried Seinecke, they thought this was a great adventure to come here. Obviously, for somebody like Werner Koch was very different. Obviously, I could not. So by nature, right, like I interviewed people who were very young at the time when they came to IIT Madras, whereas the more senior faculty like Werner Koch, obviously they are no more because they were already in their later years when they came as faculty. So for them it was obviously a bit different. Yes. Yeah, so no, I mean, I don't know.
Did you meet Mr. Ebert of the workshop?
No.
You did not meet him?
No, I was actually in contact with his wife.
Ah, yes.
But I never came to interview her. But she was still around. I don't know about now. I think I contacted her, but it kind of never worked out. But then for my own research, I have to say I was never focusing on the workshop itself. So I ended up not interviewing her. If I would have written a paper specifically on the workshop, I guess I would have done so. I would have probably tried to find some of the other, not Mr. Ebert, but some of the other mechanics who were.
No, I think, yes. Wasn't he in charge of the workshop?
Yeah, but he was not. Look, Ebert. No, look, Ebert was not an academic at all.
Yes.
And one has to understand that as well. So this is really where Indian society obviously has a very different kind of structure. Even though, I mean, specifically, Ms. Preuss, who has written a book on the history of Indo-German collaboration, who has also written a bit about IIT Madras. Obviously, there was a class difference between the people at the workshop and the academic professors, but it's never that pronounced in Germany. So Mr. Ebert, actually, I know pretty well because his background was very similar to my own father's background, who ran a workshop. So these are people who came through the apprenticeship system.
Yes.
They've never studied in a university. They've never studied even in a college. So their kind of training, Mr. Ebert said that himself, the first year of his apprenticeship, he was only filing. He's been filing, so students here have complained that they had to file for, yes, I don't know, weeks or whatever, right? Or yes, they had to learn filing, but he said he was filing for an entire year, right? And so this was the kind of training they got, right? Like, so very hands-on with machines. They were master, like they became journeymen, then masters, right? Like, and so there were other people here, right? Like who were also, I don't know, carpenters or kind of metal workers, electricians, right? Like who came through the apprenticeship systems, who ran the workshop. And I would have liked to interview them, right? And there was this kind of problem that Mr. Ebert, for example, I think had a telephone while some of the professors didn't have one, right? Like, and said why he's not an academic, why does he have a telephone, whatever. And there was also a kind of social, like kind of how they socially mingled, that the professors were more among themselves and the workshop staff was more among themselves. But in general, the thing is with people like Mr. Ebert, they were certainly not working class, they were middle class, right? Like that's the understanding of German journeymen, German craftspeople, they're middle class, right? Like, and certainly also the understanding of my father, right? And so they were not academics, right? Like they really came from this kind of very hands-on craft, what in Germany is considered craft. In Britain, you would probably not call it craft, you would say technician or workshop, I don't know, whatever, right? Like, but in Germany, these are all, my father was, for example, always very proud about this, right? Like the craft tradition. He said, look, mechanical engineering came from mill making, right? Like traditional mill making. And you have this kind of understanding as well that in Europe, right, and specifically in Germany, that the Industrial Revolution also owned a lot to craft and the development of craft, right? Like there is this discussion also in Britain that, for example, James Watt was not an academic engineer in that sense. He was a practitioner. And the science of thermodynamics was only developed after the invention of the steam engine. So the steam engine actually came from practice, came from craft, not from intellectual tinkering. Yes. And there's a very strong tradition there, right? Like obviously then you have other kind of fields like electrical engineering that obviously grew very much out of research, chemical engineering that grew very much out of research and not out of craft. But still there is this entire discourse about the importance of practice. And this is also why the Germans had such a focus on the workshop, right? Like they have to say, look, you have to understand how things are made on the shop floor. Yes. You cannot be an engineer if you don't understand this. So you have to learn filing. There's no way around it. And obviously this was a clash with also, I mean, engineering as a profession in India came from a very different direction, right? Like it was more the British administration of British colonial projects, right?
So this brings us right back to the starting point of IIT Madras, where there was this I mean, a double kind of view of what should be set up. So, but that also brings me to the end of my questions. So, if you have anything more to add about your experience in these related researches and your efforts, we could end this talk with that.
No, I think this is fine. I mean, obviously I could say much more about my experience at IIT Madras, but I think this is fine. I mean, I think specifically for the function of what this interview is supposed to serve, I think this is fine. So, if you don't have any more questions or any more issues, obviously I'm happy to discuss. But
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you then, Roland.
Yeah. I think, yeah. No, thank you.